On Saturday, the National Conservatism Conference took place. Speakers from across the right made speeches on nationalism, woke culture, and some rhetoric that seemed dangerously close to fascism. The conference included high-profile MPs such as Suella Braverman, Jacob Rees-Mogg, as well as right-wing figures such as Douglas Murray, Melanie Phillips, David Starkey, and many more. To get a flavour of the conference, we have a couple of clips. First up, Miriam Coates on the big issue that faces conservatism today.
I don't care if you're a red Tory, a communitarian, a follower of Burke, or, heaven forbid, a libertarian free marketeer. None of these traditions has a future. None of our philosophical musings or policy proposals will amount to anything long-lasting unless we address the one overarching threat to British conservatism, and indeed the whole of Western society. No, it's not climate change. It's not Russia or China or Iran. It's not the neo-Marxist ideology that has so weakened our institutions. It's not inflation or taxation or poor productivity. No. There is one critical outcome that liberal individualism has completely failed to deliver, and that is babies.
I love that. It's not climate change, it's not the neo-Marxism that's destroying our institutions, it's babies. Now, her speech was alluding to birth rates, but not before littering our ears with a bingo card of words. That was the theme of this conference, which just showed there wasn't really much substance as opposed to just generating buzzwords. However, there were some speakers who were absolutely clear in what they said, amounting huge national monstrosities such as the Holocaust as simple oopsies.
This is in some ways still a controversial thing to say, because in Europe in particular, nationalism after all sounds different depending on the country you're in. Nationalism in Israel sounds different to nationalism in America, sounds different to nationalism in Italy, sounds different to nationalism here in Britain. But the cordon sanitaire, which used to exist around nationalism until recent years, existed not because we didn't trust the idea of love of country, not because, I would argue, there was anything wrong with nationalism in a British context. It all came from a recognition that there was a problem with nationalism in a German context. And that is simply a historical fact. But I see no reason why every other country in the world should be prevented from feeling pride in itself because the Germans mucked up twice in a century.
They just mucked up. Really astonishing stuff. Now, it doesn't stop there. We have more unhinged takes from David Starkey. This was shared and then deleted from the National Conservatism Twitter account. The reason that the left has such ire for the Jews is jealousy. They want to replace the Holocaust with slavery in order to wield its legacy as a weapon against Western culture. It's just truly mind-boggling stuff. I think the fact that it was deleted shows that for even some conservatives, it was a bit too crazy. Joining me now to discuss this clown show of a conference, friend of the show No Justice, is here to provide her insight. No Justice, I hope you're well.
Yeah, I'm not doing too bad, thank you. Thank you for having me on today.
So, talk me through this conference. A couple of highlights included Cates and Murray, but conservatives have all just lost their minds, haven't they?
Yeah, they absolutely have lost their minds in some of a sense, but I also think that this is far more calculated. Right? A lot of this is far more calculated than a lot of people will give it credit for, because it's very, very clear, right, that what this is a response to. This is a response to the fact that we are looking at the dying embers of a political philosophy that has not seen any amount of ascendancy in this country for a very, very long time, a good 30 years. Obviously, the death of big C conservatism started with the kind of liberal reforms of our political system under the Tony Blair administration, which was then continued by the kind of liberal conservatism of David Cameron and Theresa May. This very kind of fringe ideology now has really, it's looking like it's not going to be part of the national zeitgeist as far as time goes on. I mean, if you look at the younger generation, none of them believe any of this stuff, right? It's complete antithesis of young people's ideology nowadays. And they, quite frankly, have got nothing left to lose than spend lots of money and lots of time trying to embed this kind of ideology back into the public consciousness. Luckily, I don't think that it will in particular have many legs, especially not when you have people like Douglas Murray making such quite alarming statements about the crimes of Nazi Germany. The worst excesses of nationalism clearly was what happened in post-Weimar Germany. It's very clear that they've basically ignored the excesses of nationalism in loads of other countries where similar kind of ethnic purges have happened, right? What about Serbia? What about Russia? What about Uganda? What about Indonesia? Nationalism has, lots of blood on its hands at this point. So to try and wave all of that away with the Germans mucked up twice, and that's the only reason why people dislike nationalism, it's really telling about where these people are coming from. They know the kind of people that they are adjacent to rhetorically when they talk about this stuff. The moral degeneracy of quote-unquote progressivism, the old norms of society that have underpinned especially very Christian society for a very, very long time have been broken down. This is not just a response to these things existing in a vacuum either. It's also a response to these things happening specifically in the minds of young people. Well, the rhetoric that we saw was talking about the issues of what's happening amongst children in this country, what young people are talking about, the ideology of young people that is so vastly different to the generations that preceded them. I mean, especially the older generations that preceded them. And they are struggling to cope with the fact that they have not been able to pass down these ideas. They have no genuine solutions to the people's genuine material conditions. And young people have been the people who've been most screwed over by that. They've moved to leftism and progressivism mostly as kind of nascent political movement in response to the failures of neoliberalism. It triggers that conspiracy part of right-wing people's brains, where they can't just accept the ideology has changed over time, right? They can't accept that this kind of bell curve of normative ideology where you have most people believing in centrism and then the fringe ideologies on either side of the spectrum, right? Seeing a large group of very left-wing, very progressive young people mean their brain can only comprehend that as some kind of fifth columnist who's trying to indoctrinate children, right? There's a lot of speaking, and Miriam Cates brings this up a lot, both in Parliament and actually at the conference that we saw as well, talking about the idea that people like our educators, people, academics, teachers, lecturers, people at university are somehow indoctrinating young people into wokeism, into progressivism, which obviously they're not. And it just shows how out of touch these people really are. But of course, this kind of conspiracy mindset is going to lead people to very dark places when it comes to the kind of fascist rhetoric that you're talking about. Things like cultural Marxism, right? Which in itself is a conspiracy, a Nazi-era conspiracy theory, came out of der Bolschewismus or Kulturbolschewismus, cultural Bolshevism, which was a literal Nazi party-era conspiracy theory, that Jewish academics were specifically conspiring to try and indoctrinate people through academia to infect society with moral degeneracy to bring down, quote-unquote, the West. How many times over the course of the conference did you hear references to Western culture, Western society? David Starkey was talking about that yesterday, I believe. I mean, what's crazy as well, right, is that they would call this kind of cultural Marxism, right? As I said before, this idea that people are being brainwashed by progressive ideas, that somehow their nationalist perspective is supposed to be somehow the default, when I don't think it ever really should be. But the idea that this is fundamentally anti-Western is also deranged, also stupid. Like, if we're Marxists, right, if Marxism is what's underpinning the kind of progressive ideology that they so despise, Marxism is Western ideology. Karl Marx was German, like all the people from the Frankfurt School, right? That another group of people who tend to live rent-free in the minds of these conspiracy theorists, they were all Western philosophy. Like, this is entirely a branch of Western philosophy. The idea that this could somehow undermine the West by implementing it around society is a ludicrous thing for them to try and even imply. I think the funniest bit, though, from the conference, really, as far as I'm concerned, was Catherine Burblesing, who's known as being the strictest headmistress in the country, and she does say some genuinely awful things that I think are worth calling out in a serious nature. But she started quoting fucking Russell Crowe during her speech, and one point, oh god, part of what's frustrating as well about all of this is so much of it is clearly Twitter brained, right? So much of the people who've kind of bought into this ideology kind of recent times, the actual people who are converts to this recently, it's very, very clear that a lot of these were just kind of boomers who had their brains broken during the pandemic when they had nothing else to do but be on social media and just started taking loads of conspiracy theories. And peak Twitter brain was Catherine Burblesing up on her podium talking about people standing up and being counted. And one of the things that she used as an example of people standing up and being counted was using Twitter under your real name. I'm like, how Twitter brains do you have to be when you're discussing, as far as they are concerned, fundamental systemic problems with the nature of Western society being undermined by who they feel as being adverse forces, you know, that could theoretically destabilize society. Because that's the real fear, a lot of this, right? You look at the fears around trans people and upsetting the natural order of things, which could collapse society. That's where their genuine fears come from. To then take that and say, you know what the real problem is? People using pseudonyms on Twitter. I find that incredibly funny and very telling about the kind of people who buy into this stuff.